You really think a dock mechanic belongs at my charity dinner? Vivienne Halbrook's voice sliced through the Marina restaurant, sharp enough to turn every head in the room. And who let that orphan girl wander in here with you? They laughed when the Marina worker and the orphan girl stood near the luxury dinner tables. They said people like them didn't belong anywhere near real wealth or real power. Then, something strange happened. The quiet father didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't even look angry. Because the truth about him was something none of them were ready to hear. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. People watching the moment might have thought this was just another scene of arrogance, another rich woman humiliating someone she believed was beneath her. But beneath the surface, something very different was unfolding. The calm in the mechanic's eyes wasn't a weakness. The silence in the orphan girl beside him wasn't fear. And before the night was over, the entire room would understand exactly why mocking that man had been a terrible mistake. Because sometimes the people standing quietly in the background are the ones who once carried the weight of other people's lives. The girl didn't lower her eyes when the laughter spread across the restaurant. Instead, she stood still beside the mechanic, her shoulders squared even though her clothes still smelled faintly of engine grease and sea air. Alara Quinn had spent most of her life in places where nobody expected anything from her. An orphanage beside a naval base. Temporary jobs no one else wanted. Long mornings watching workers repair boats while wealthy tourists stepped around puddles of seawater without noticing the hands that kept their luxury afloat. So a woman like Vivienne Halbrook didn't scare her. The orphan girl simply looked at the table full of polished jewelry and silk dresses, then back at the mechanic beside her. Ronan Vale still hadn't reacted. That was the strange part. Most men would have snapped back. Some might have stormed out. A few might have tried desperately to defend themselves. But the dock mechanic only rested one rough hand on the back of an empty chair and glanced toward the marina windows as if checking something only he could see. Outside, hundreds of yachts rocked gently against their ropes. Moonlight slid across the water like silver paint. Inside the restaurant, the air smelled of expensive wine and quiet cruelty. Vivienne crossed her arms, clearly irritated by the lack of reaction. "Well?" she demanded. "Didn't you hear me?" Several guests chuckled. One man in a tuxedo leaned toward his friend and muttered loudly enough for others to hear. Maybe he's still trying to figure out which fork to use. More laughter followed. The orphan girl noticed something subtle then. The mechanic's eyes weren't on Vivienne at all. They were moving slowly across the room, studying exits, windows, the kitchen door, the marina docks beyond the glass. It was the kind of careful observation she had seen before. The kind that belonged to people who had spent their lives preparing for emergencies. Alara folded her arms and stepped slightly forward. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "we're just here to help the restaurant staff set up the dock access." Vivienne's smile sharpened. "Oh, I'm sure you are." She looked Alara up and down as if evaluating something distasteful. "Is this some sort of charity program?" she asked the room. "Hire a mechanic and an orphan for the evening so the guests can feel generous?" The girl felt the familiar heat of humiliation rise in her chest. Not anger, not quite. More like an old memory pressing against her ribs. Years of people assuming she didn't matter. Years of being invisible until someone needed something heavy carried or something broken fixed. But the mechanic beside her shifted slightly. Still calm. Still quiet. "Dinner's starting soon." Ronan said gently, "We won't be in your way." His voice was low and steady, not defensive, not apologetic, just certain. Vivienne blinked. That calm unsettled her more than any argument would have. You already are in my way, she replied. This event is for donors and investors, people who actually matter. The mechanic nodded once. Understood, he turned slightly as if preparing to leave. But something outside the window caught his attention again. His eyes narrowed. The orphan girl noticed the change instantly. A small shift. A tightening in his posture. She followed his gaze through the marina glass. Far out on the dock, one of the larger yachts had started venting a thin stream of gray smoke near the engine hatch. Most people inside the restaurant hadn't noticed yet. But Ronan Vale had. He exhaled slowly. Then he looked back at the room full of laughing strangers. And for the first time that evening, the mechanic spoke with quiet authority. "Ma'am," he said, glancing toward the docks again, "you might want your guests to step away from those windows." Vivienne frowned. And why exactly would I? A sharp alarm suddenly echoed from outside. Every conversation in the restaurant stopped at once. Smoke began rising thicker across the marina docks. And the orphan girl realized something in that moment that none of the wealthy guests understood yet. The calm mechanic beside her hadn't been ignoring the humiliation. He had been watching the water. Smoke curled thicker over the marina, drifting across the moonlit docks like a warning no one inside the restaurant had been prepared to hear. For a moment, the guests simply stared. Then the alarm outside shrieked again, louder this time, sharp and mechanical, echoing off the rows of polished yachts rocking gently against their ropes. Vivienne Halbrook turned toward the windows, irritation flickering across her face. What on earth is that noise? Someone near the glass pointed. I think one of the boats is smoking. Several diners stood quickly, chairs scraping across the floor as they rushed to see. Beyond the windows, gray clouds were spilling from the engine compartment of a large white yacht docked near the main fuel line. A few nervous laughs broke out. It's probably nothing, one man said dismissively. Those things have systems for that. But the dock mechanic beside the orphan girl had already stepped closer to the window. His eyes moved quickly, counting distances, scanning the wind direction, studying the position of the other vessels tied nearby. The calm on his face hadn't changed. Alara noticed the tension in his shoulders, though. She'd seen that posture before. The quiet focus of someone calculating consequences. The restaurant manager hurried out from the kitchen, wiping his hands nervously. Everyone please stay calm. Marina security will handle it. Another alarm rang outside. This one was different. Higher. Urgent. And then a dock worker burst through the side entrance, breathless. The yacht's engine compartment caught fire, he shouted. Fuel lines running right under the dock. The room exploded into chaos. Chairs pushed back. Glasses clattered. Several guests rushed toward the windows while others scrambled toward the exit doors. Vivienne spun toward the manager. Why hasn't anyone done anything about it? Security's on the way, the man said quickly. But the mechanic beside Alara was already moving. He stepped toward the marina doors, his boots silent against the polished floor. Vivienne's voice cut through the noise again. Excuse me, where exactly do you think you're going? He paused, turned back slowly. To stop that fire, he said simply. A few guests scoffed. You? One woman laughed nervously. You're a dock mechanic. That's right, Ronan replied. Vivienne crossed her arms again, clearly offended by the idea. You'll stay right here, she said sharply. The marina has professionals for situations like this. Outside, a small burst of orange flame flickered along the yacht's side. Several people gasped. The wind carried the smell of burning fuel toward the restaurant. The mechanic glanced at the fire again. Then back at Vivienne. If that spreads to the dock line, he said calmly, every boat out there goes up with it. The room fell quiet. Someone whispered, Is that true? The manager looked uncertain. Vivienne hesitated, but only for a moment. "I'm sure the fire department will be here any minute," she said, forcing confidence into her voice. Ronan didn't argue. He simply pushed open the marina doors. Cold night air rushed into the restaurant as he stepped onto the dock. Elara followed without hesitation. Behind them, the room buzzed with confusion. Several guests moved closer to the windows to watch. Outside, the smoke was already spreading across the dock planks. A few marina workers were standing nearby, unsure what to do as flames flickered along the yacht's engine hatch. The mechanic's voice cut through the panic instantly. "Kill the fuel valve under dock 3, he called out. "Now." The workers froze. One of them blinked. "Who?" "Dock 3, Ronan repeated, pointing sharply toward the fuel line panel near the walkway. 30 seconds or this spreads." The authority in his tone was impossible to ignore. 2 workers ran immediately. Elara grabbed a nearby emergency extinguisher without being told. She hurried beside him as he approached the smoking yacht. "You knew that was coming," she said quietly. "Seen it before," he replied. Flames snapped suddenly from the engine hatch. The heat rolled across the dock like a wave. Inside the restaurant, guests pressed closer to the glass, watching the scene unfold. Vivienne stood near the window, her expression tight with disbelief. "Why are they listening to him?" she muttered. Outside, Ronan climbed onto the edge of the yacht with the steady balance of someone who knew exactly where every step should land. "Extinguisher," he said. Elara handed it up. He pulled the pin and blasted foam directly into the hatch opening. Smoke erupted upward. For several tense seconds, nothing happened. Then the flames sputtered, faded, and finally died beneath the thick white spray. The dock fell silent. Even the alarm seemed to pause. One of the marina workers stared at the mechanic standing on the yacht. "How did you know exactly what to do?" Ronan climbed back down slowly. "Experience," he said. Elara glanced toward the restaurant windows. Nearly every guest was watching now. The humiliation from earlier hung in the air like something unfinished. Vivienne stepped outside onto the dock, heels tapping sharply against the wood. "Well," she said stiffly, "that was fortunate." The mechanic didn't respond. He simply returned the extinguisher to its place. But a small voice suddenly spoke from behind Vivienne. A little girl had slipped past the restaurant crowd and onto the dock. She stared at Ronan with wide eyes. Recognition slowly spread across her face. "Mom," she whispered. Vivienne frowned. "Lena, stay back." But the girl wasn't looking at the fire. She was looking directly at the quiet dock mechanic. And then she said something that made several marina workers turn their heads. "Commander?" Before the next part begins, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens when the truth finally comes out. The mechanic froze. Slowly, he turned toward the child. The marina dock had gone strangely quiet after the fire died out. Smoke still drifted above the yacht, thin and ghost-like against the moonlit water, but the panic had faded into uneasy silence. Everyone on the dock was watching now. Workers, restaurant staff, and the wealthy guests who had stepped outside to see what had happened. But the little girl wasn't looking at any of them. She was staring directly at Ronan Vale. "Commander?" she said again, a little louder this time. Vivienne Halbrook stiffened instantly. "Lena, stop that. Come here." The girl didn't move. She tilted her head, studying the mechanic as if trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly come together. Ronan stood very still. For a moment, Elara thought he might deny it. But the expression on his face wasn't surprise. It was recognition. Quiet, reluctant recognition. He climbed down fully from the yacht and stepped back onto the dock. "You shouldn't be out here," he said gently to the child. "Smoke isn't safe to breathe." The girl blinked. "You remember me," she said. It wasn't a question. Vivienne's patience snapped. "Lena." I said, "Come here now." The girl finally turned toward her mother, but only for a second. "Mom, he saved me." A ripple of murmurs spread across the dock. "Saved her?" Vivienne frowned. "What are you talking about?" But Lena was already looking back at Ronan. Her voice softened. "You pulled me out of the water." Elara felt a strange chill pass through her. She watched the mechanic carefully. He rubbed the back of his neck once, like a man who had hoped a certain chapter of his life would stay closed. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. But the girl shook her head. No, it wasn't. More guests stepped closer now, curiosity replacing the earlier amusement. One of the marina workers leaned toward another. "What's the kid talking about?" Lena took a few small steps toward Ronan. "You were wearing the blue uniform," she said. "And the big orange helicopter came." The mechanic sighed softly. Vivienne's voice grew sharper. "Lena, enough of this nonsense," but the girl didn't seem to hear her. "You told me not to look down," she continued. "You said the ocean was loud, but it couldn't hurt me." The dock workers exchanged confused glances. Elara felt her heart beat faster. Blue uniform. Helicopter. Ocean rescue. The pieces started sliding into place. Ronan crouched slightly so he was eye level with the girl. "You were on a sailing trip," he said, gently. "Storm hit faster than anyone expected." Lena nodded eagerly. Our boat flipped. A collective murmur passed through the crowd. Vivienne looked completely lost now. "That accident happened years ago," she said slowly. "You were barely 5, yes," Lena said. Then she pointed directly at the mechanic. "And he was the commander." The words landed on the dock like a dropped anchor. A marina worker near the fuel line blinked in disbelief. "Commander?" Another man stepped forward slowly, squinting at Ronan. "Wait, hold on." He walked closer, studying the mechanic's face more carefully. Then his eyes widened. No way, several guests leaned closer to hear. "What?" someone whispered. The worker rubbed his jaw, still staring. "You're Ronan Vale." The mechanic didn't answer immediately. Elara watched the tension return to his shoulders. The worker let out a short breath. "Former Naval Rescue Commander." A wave of stunned silence spread across the dock. One of the wealthy donors laughed awkwardly. "That's ridiculous," but the worker shook his head firmly. "No, I remember him. Saw his picture in the marina office years ago. Guy led half the Atlantic rescue missions around here." Another dockhand nodded slowly. "Coast Guard used to call him when things got bad." More whispers spread among the crowd. The mechanic finally straightened up. "It's not important," he said quietly. But Lena shook her head again. "It is." She stepped closer. "You saved 4 people that day." Ronan glanced toward the water. 5, he corrected softly. The girl smiled. "I was the smallest one." Vivienne's face had gone pale. She looked around at the growing crowd of guests now staring at the mechanic she had mocked less than 10 minutes earlier. "That can't be right," she said stiffly. One of the marina workers folded his arms. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "that yacht fired just now?" He handled it exactly like a rescue commander would, another man added, and he knew where every fuel valve on this dock was. The realization began spreading through the crowd. The dock mechanic wasn't just a dock mechanic. Elara crossed her arms quietly. She glanced at Ronan. "You were hoping nobody here would recognize you," she said under her breath. He gave a small nod. Something like that. Behind them, more guests stepped onto the dock, drawn by the commotion. Phones were coming out now. Someone whispered, "Is that really him?" Vivienne struggled to regain control of the moment. "This is absurd," she snapped. "Even if he was some sort of rescue officer once, that doesn't change the fact that—" But she stopped mid-sentence. because the restaurant manager had just stepped outside holding a tablet. His voice trembled slightly. "Miss Halbrook." She turned sharply. "What now?" He swallowed. I looked him up. The entire dock leaned in, and the manager slowly turned the screen toward her. Displayed across the marina database was an old photograph. A younger Ronan Vale stood beside a naval rescue helicopter. The caption underneath read, "Commander Ronan Vale, Atlantic Emergency Response Unit." Vivienne stared at the screen, then at the mechanic she had mocked in front of an entire room, and for the first time that evening, she didn't have anything to say. And for the first time that evening, Vivienne Halbrook didn't have anything to say. The marina dock felt strangely different now. Only minutes earlier it had been a stage for laughter and quiet cruelty. Now the same people who had watched the humiliation were staring at the mechanic as if the ground beneath them had shifted. The tablet in the restaurant manager's hands glowed softly in the night air. Commander Ronan Vale. The words hung there like a quiet verdict. Vivienne blinked once, then again, as if the image might somehow rearrange itself into something more comfortable. This has to be a mistake," she said finally, her voice tighter than before. But no one moved to support her. A few guests had stepped closer to the screen, reading the information for themselves. One of the dock workers scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Says here he led 14 open water rescue operations." Another leaned in, "and coordinated helicopter extractions during hurricane evacuations." Murmurs rippled through the crowd again. Alara watched the mechanic beside her. He looked exactly the same as he had before the revelation, quiet, steady, completely unimpressed with the sudden attention. If anything, he seemed slightly uncomfortable. He rubbed the back of his neck again. "It's old news," Ronan said calmly. "Nothing special." A man in a tailored suit scoffed softly. "Nothing special?" "You ran naval rescue missions." Ronan shrugged once. "Used to." Vivienne's composure cracked a little more. "But why are you working here?" she demanded. Her question carried the same sharp edge as before, but now there was confusion underneath it. People don't just go from commanding rescue teams to fixing boats. Ronan glanced at the water for a moment. The marina had begun to settle again. Smoke still drifted faintly above the yacht he'd extinguished, but the danger had passed. "Sometimes they do," he replied quietly. Vivienne folded her arms again, clinging to control. "You expect me to believe you gave up that career to become a dock mechanic?" The mechanic's answer came easily. "I didn't give it up," he nodded toward Lena. "I chose something else." The little girl's eyes widened slightly. "You retired because of me?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Not exactly." The dock workers were watching him now with open respect. One of them shook his head in disbelief. "Commander, you coordinated the North Atlantic winter rescues, didn't you?" Ronan looked mildly surprised the man knew that. "Yeah," he admitted. The worker exhaled. "My brother was on one of those fishing boats you pulled out of the ice storm 5 years ago." He extended a rough hand. "Name's Luis." Ronan shook it quietly. Glad he made it back, the interaction sent another ripple through the watching crowd. Stories were beginning to surface, fragments of recognition, memories of news reports and rescues that had once filled headlines before quietly fading from public attention. Alara noticed how the tone around the dock had completely changed. Just minutes earlier, the wealthy guests had been laughing. Now many of them looked almost embarrassed. But Vivienne Halbrook wasn't ready to surrender the moment. Her voice rose again. "That still doesn't explain why you're standing here tonight dressed like a marina laborer." The words sounded smaller now, weaker than before. Ronan didn't react with anger. He simply leaned against the railing beside the dock. "Because that's what I am now." Vivienne shook her head sharply. That makes no sense, maybe not to you. Elara stepped forward then. Her voice was calm but firm. Some people don't measure success the same way. Vivienne turned toward her, irritation returning. Oh, please. The orphan girl didn't flinch. You mocked him because of his job, she continued evenly. But that job just saved every boat in this marina. Several guests nodded quietly. Vivienne opened her mouth to respond, but another voice interrupted. A security officer had arrived at the far end of the dock, jogging toward them with 2 marina firefighters behind him. "What's the situation?" the officer called. One of the dock workers pointed toward Ronan immediately. He handled it, the officer slowed, confused. Handled what? The engine fire, Luis explained. Commander Vale shut the fuel valve and killed it before it spread. The officer looked at Ronan. Recognition dawned instantly. You're kidding. He walked closer, studying the mechanic carefully. Then he laughed in disbelief. Well, I'll be damned. Vivienne looked between them, growing more unsettled by the second. You know him too? The officer nodded. Ma'am, every emergency unit along this coast knows him. He gestured toward the quiet mechanic. That man trained half the rescue coordinators in this region. The crowd shifted again. Phones were definitely recording now. Someone whispered this whole thing is unbelievable, but Lena wasn't paying attention to the adults. She had stepped closer to Ronan again. Commander, she said softly, tugging his sleeve. He looked down at her. Yes? You told me that day something important. He raised an eyebrow. Did I? She nodded. You said the ocean doesn't care who people think they are. The dock fell quiet again. The girl continued. You said when things go wrong, the only thing that matters is who's willing to help. Ronan smiled faintly. That sounds like something I'd say. Lena turned slowly toward her mother. Mom. Vivienne met her daughter's gaze uncertainly. You laughed at the man who saved me. The words landed heavier than any accusation from the crowd. For a moment, even the wind across the marina seemed to pause. Vivienne Halbrook stood on the dock surrounded by witnesses. The same witnesses who had heard her mock him earlier. And now every one of them knew exactly who he was. The dock remained silent for several long seconds. Even the soft creaking of ropes against metal cleats seemed louder than usual, as if the marina itself was listening. Vivienne Halbrook stood frozen. A few minutes earlier, she had been the unquestioned center of the evening, host of the charity dinner, surrounded by wealthy donors and investors eager to impress her. Now all of those same eyes were looking somewhere else, at the quiet dock mechanic. Or rather, the former commander she had just mocked. Vivienne forced a stiff smile, the kind used by people accustomed to recovering control of uncomfortable situations. Well, she said briskly, brushing invisible dust from her sleeve, that's certainly interesting. Her voice carried a sharp edge of forced composure. But surely we can all agree that a past career doesn't excuse wandering into a private event. The reaction from the crowd was immediate. Several guests exchanged glances. One woman frowned openly. Luis, the dock worker, shook his head slowly. You serious right now? Vivienne turned sharply toward him. I beg your pardon? You heard the kid, he said, gesturing toward Lena. And the officer just confirmed it. The security officer nodded. Commander Vale coordinated rescue units across 3 states. Ronan sighed quietly. Former commander, he corrected. Doesn't change what he did, the officer replied. A few people clapped softly before catching themselves. The applause died quickly, but the message had already landed. Respect had shifted. Vivienne felt it slipping away. Her gaze snapped toward Ronan again. If you're truly that accomplished, she said, why hide it? He shrugged slightly. didn't feel the need to announce it. That's ridiculous. Elara crossed her arms beside him. No, she said calmly, it's humility. Vivienne scoffed. Oh, please. The orphan girl didn't back down. You mocked him because of what you saw, she continued. Work boots. Grease on his hands. A job you think is beneath you. She gestured toward the marina. But those same hands just prevented a fuel explosion. Several guests murmured agreement. Vivienne's jaw tightened. You seem very eager to lecture people tonight, she snapped. Elara simply met her stare. I'm eager for people to show basic respect. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The tension stretched across the dock like a taut cable. Then Ronan stepped forward quietly. That's enough, he said. Both women turned toward him. He looked directly at Vivienne. The fire's out, he said calmly. No damage done. His tone wasn't confrontational. If anything, it sounded like he wanted the entire incident to end. Vivienne noticed that too, and suddenly something in her posture changed. Confidence crept back into her voice. Well then, she said lightly, since the emergency is over, perhaps we can return to the evening's purpose. She turned toward the guests. A charity dinner for maritime safety, ironically enough. A few awkward chuckles surfaced. Vivienne smiled, sensing an opportunity to reclaim the narrative. And of course, she added smoothly, we all appreciate the mechanic's quick thinking. Mechanic. The word hung there deliberately. Luce muttered under his breath, unbelievable, but Ronan didn't react. He simply looked toward the water again. The yachts were calm now, reflections dancing across the dark surface. Elara noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw. He wasn't offended, he was tired. Tired of attention, tired of explanations. She stepped closer to him. You okay? She asked quietly. Yeah. You sure? He nodded once. Just ready to get back to work, inside the restaurant, staff had begun reopening the doors. Guests were slowly drifting back toward their tables. The crisis had passed. But something about the atmosphere had permanently shifted. A group of donors whispered among themselves near the entrance. One of them glanced back at Ronan. I remember those rescues, the man said softly. They were all over the news. Another nodded. And we just watched him get mocked for fixing boats. The conversation spread quietly. Respect, admiration, even embarrassment. Vivienne noticed the shift too. Her smile faltered. The crowd wasn't reacting the way she expected. Instead of returning to the dinner as if nothing had happened, many guests were still watching Ronan. Some were approaching him now. One older investor extended a hand. Commander Vale, he said warmly, an honor to meet you. Ronan shook it politely. Just Ronan is fine. Another guest asked, Are you still involved with rescue operations? Not anymore. Why not? He hesitated slightly. Then glanced toward Lena. Life changes. The girl smiled. Vivienne watched the interaction unfold with growing discomfort. The mechanic she had tried to dismiss was quietly becoming the most respected person on the dock. Phones continued recording. Someone whispered, This story's going to be everywhere tomorrow. Elara noticed that. She leaned closer to Ronan. You realize what's happening, right? He followed her gaze toward the watching guests. Yeah, they're not going to forget tonight. He exhaled slowly. I was hoping they would. The orphan girl shook her head. Too late for that. Inside the restaurant, the lights glowed warmly again. But outside on the dock, something else was spreading. Not fire this time. Something far more uncomfortable for Vivienne Holbrook. The truth. And once people see the truth, it's impossible to pretend the humiliation never happened. By the way, if you're enjoying stories about hidden strength and quiet dignity, Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because this night at the marina was only beginning to reveal what really mattered. The quiet conversations continued spreading through the dock like slow-moving waves. Guests who had once been focused on champagne glasses and investment talk were now gathered in small circles, whispering about rescues, helicopters, and the man standing beside the fuel valve panel like it was just another night at work. Ronan Vale clearly wished it wasn't. He moved toward the edge of the dock, checking the yacht's engine hatch one last time. The metal was still warm beneath his hand, but the danger had passed. Behind him, the crowd remained. Ilara leaned against the railing nearby, arms folded. "You could have walked away," she said softly. He didn't look up. From the fire? No, from the attention. Ronan let out a quiet breath. "I tried." She nodded slightly. That much was obvious. But attention had a strange way of chasing people who never asked for it. A few steps away, Luis was still talking to the security officer. "I'm telling you," the dock worker said, shaking his head. The way he called that fuel valve, like he'd mapped the whole marina. The officer chuckled. "That's exactly how rescue commanders operate." Vivienne Halbrook heard every word. She stood near the restaurant entrance, arms folded tightly now, watching the growing admiration around the mechanic she had mocked. The situation had slipped beyond her control. That realization irritated her more than anything. She stepped forward again. "Well," she said loudly, drawing attention back to herself, "it's certainly impressive that our local mechanic has such colorful stories." The dock grew quiet again. Ilara's eyes narrowed slightly. Several guests frowned, but Ronan remained calm. He turned slowly toward Vivienne. "Not stories," he said quietly. "History." The simple correction carried weight. Vivienne forced a smile. "Either way, it's a charming tale." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Luz looked ready to argue again, but Ronan raised a hand slightly. It was enough. The dock worker backed down. The mechanic looked at Vivienne without anger. "You're hosting a charity for maritime safety tonight," he said. "Yes. Then the people who keep marinas running probably deserve some respect." The words weren't harsh, but they landed with quiet precision. Vivienne's smile tightened. "I respect people who earn their place." Ronan glanced down at the worn dock planks beneath his boots. "These docks," he said calmly, "were rebuilt after the hurricane 3 years ago." She blinked. "And?" "I was here for that." Several workers nodded immediately. Luis spoke up. "Worked 16-hour shifts rebuilding fuel lines," another man added, "while half the city evacuated." Vivienne waved a dismissive hand. "That still doesn't explain why someone with your supposed background is fixing ropes and engines." Ronan didn't answer right away. The marina breeze moved gently across the water, carrying the scent of salt and diesel. Then Lena spoke again. "You said something else that day." All heads turned back toward the girl. She had moved closer again, standing just beside Ronan now. "What was that?" he asked gently. She thought for a moment. "You said rescuing people doesn't stop when the uniform comes off." The mechanic smiled faintly. "That's true." Vivienne looked between them impatiently. "This conversation is becoming ridiculous," but the security officer shook his head. "Actually, it's becoming very clear," he gestured toward Ronan. "Commander Vale trained half the emergency crews on this coast." Vivienne's voice sharpened. "And yet he's fixing boats." "Yes," the officer said calmly, "because someone has to." A few guests chuckled quietly. The tension around the dock had shifted again. Not confrontational now, something more certain. The truth was settling into place. Ilara noticed it first. People were no longer looking at Ronan with curiosity. They were looking at him with respect. Even the wealthy donors seemed unsure how to behave. One man adjusted his jacket awkwardly. "I think," he said slowly, "we may have underestimated someone tonight." Vivienne turned toward him sharply. "You're all overreacting." But the words sounded weaker now. Phones were still recording. Conversations were still spreading. And the man she had tried to humiliate had become the quiet center of the entire evening. Ronan didn't seem interested in that role. He walked back toward the restaurant doors. "I should get back to work," he said. The officer frowned. "Commander." "Just Ronan," he corrected again. The officer nodded reluctantly. "Ronan, the Marina Board will want to hear about what happened tonight." "That's fine." Luis grinned. "They should probably hear about the dinner, too." A few guests laughed. Vivienne's expression darkened. But Lena looked up at Ronan with wide eyes. "Commander?" He paused again. "Yes? You're not leaving already, are you?" He glanced toward the restaurant windows. Inside, the charity dinner guests were slowly returning to their tables. Outside, the dock workers were still watching, and somewhere in the middle of it all stood the orphan girl, who had refused to look away when the mocking started. Ronan gave a small smile. "Looks like the night isn't finished yet." The quiet words settled over the dock as the last of the smoke drifted away into the dark sky above the marina. Ronan rested one hand on the railing, staring out at the calm water for a moment longer. The emergency was over, the flames gone, but the ripple from what had just happened continued moving through the crowd like a tide that refused to settle. Behind him, conversations grew louder, not mocking anymore, respectful, curious. The same guests who had laughed earlier were now whispering among themselves, glancing back toward the mechanic with something that looked a lot like embarrassment. Elara noticed it clearly. She pushed off the railing and stepped beside him. "You really plan to go back to fixing ropes after all that?" she asked quietly. He shrugged. That was the plan. She studied him. "You're terrible at staying invisible," Ronan smirked faintly. "Tonight wasn't my idea." Across the dock, Luis was still telling the story to a small group of donors who had gathered near the fuel valve panel. "I'm serious," the dock worker said, gesturing toward the yacht. He spotted that engine smoke before any alarm even triggered. One of the donors adjusted his glasses. "That kind of awareness only comes from training." "Years of it," the security officer added. "Rescue commanders have to read situations fast." Another guest glanced toward Ronan again. "Why didn't we know about him?" Luis chuckled. "Because he doesn't go around announcing it." That answer seemed to make the donors even more curious. A few more people drifted closer. Vivienne Halbrook watched the growing circle with tightening lips. Her event had turned into something she hadn't planned. And worse, the spotlight had shifted. Instead of admiring the luxury marina, the guests were now fascinated by the quiet dock mechanic. She stepped forward again, heels tapping sharply against the wooden boards. "Well," she announced loudly, "since the excitement appears to be over, perhaps everyone can return to the dinner." Some guests obeyed out of habit. But many stayed where they were. Their attention remained fixed on Ronan. One man approached him carefully. "Commander Vale," he said respectfully. Ronan sighed softly. "It's just Ronan." The man smiled. "Either way, I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For reminding everyone here that real courage doesn't come with a price tag." A few guests nodded quietly. Vivienne's patience cracked again. "This entire situation is becoming theatrical," she snapped. Elara turned slowly toward her. "No," she said calmly. "It's becoming honest." Vivienne's eyes flashed. "You're very bold for someone who was just wandering into a private event." The orphan girl didn't flinch. "I was helping set up the dock access. That's not the same as belonging here." Ronan exhaled slowly. "Vivienne," he said gently. She turned sharply. "What?" He gestured toward the marina. "Everyone here belongs. The dock workers, the restaurant staff, the guests. All of them keep this place running, he continued, in different ways. Vivienne folded her arms again. You're giving a lecture now? No, he replied. Just stating something simple. Luis grinned under his breath. The donors nearby were clearly enjoying the shift. One of them whispered to another, "This is the most honest moment this event's had all night." Another man nodded. And the most valuable. Vivienne heard that. Her posture stiffened. She turned toward the restaurant doors again. "We're wasting time," she said sharply. "The charity program needs to continue." But Lena hadn't moved. The girl still stood beside Ronan, studying him carefully. "Commander," she said quietly. He glanced down. "Yes? You never told Mom what happened after the rescue." Vivienne frowned. "What rescue story haven't I heard already?" Lena tilted her head. "The one where he went back?" Ronan's expression changed slightly. "That's not important," he said. But the girl shook her head. "It is." The doc grew quiet again. Even the donors leaned closer now. Vivienne looked irritated. "What are you talking about?" Lena pointed toward the water. "That storm, when our sailboat flipped." Vivienne sighed. "Yes, you've told that story 100 times, but you never knew the rest," Lena said. Ronan rubbed the back of his neck again. "Lena." But she kept talking. "After he saved us and the helicopter took us away," her voice grew softer. "He went back into the storm." Several people blinked. Luis frowned. "Went back?" The security officer looked at Ronan carefully. "That true?" Ronan shrugged slightly. There were still people out there. The dock workers exchanged looks. The officer nodded slowly. "That's right, I remember hearing about that." Vivienne crossed her arms impatiently. "So he did his job," but the officer shook his head. "Ma'am, his team had already pulled 5 survivors from the water." He looked directly at Ronan. "And then he went back out again alone." A hush fell across the dock. The donors looked stunned. Alara felt the weight of the moment settle into place. Another quiet truth surfacing. Another layer of the man beside her revealed. Lena smiled proudly. He said no one gets left behind. Ronan looked down at the dockboards again, embarrassed by the attention. But the crowd wasn't laughing anymore. They were listening. And for Vivienne Halbrook, that silence was far more uncomfortable than the fire had been. And for Vivienne Halbrook, that silence was far more uncomfortable than the fire had been. The dock had grown completely still. The ocean moved quietly beyond the marina, waves tapping softly against the wooden pilings, but no one on the dock seemed to notice anymore. Every eye remained fixed on the mechanic standing beside the railing, or rather the commander they had just learned about. Ronan shifted slightly, clearly wishing the attention would drift somewhere else. But Lena wasn't finished. "You told me that night," she continued softly, "that people who can help have to." The little girl's voice carried across the dock in a way that made the moment feel heavier than any speech. Several guests lowered their eyes. The security officer folded his arms thoughtfully. Luis shook his head with quiet admiration. Vivienne, however, was clearly struggling. "You're telling a bedtime story," she said sharply, trying to cut through the mood. This is supposed to be a professional event, but the words didn't land the way she intended. One of the donors stepped forward. "No," the man said calmly. "It's something more important." He looked directly at Ronan. "You went back into a storm after already rescuing 5 people?" Ronan exhaled. 2 fishermen were still missing, and you found them? He nodded once. The dock workers exchanged looks again. Luis laughed softly under his breath. "Of course he did." Another worker muttered, "That's the commander we heard about." Alara watched Ronan carefully. "You really hate being the center of attention," she said quietly. He gave a small smile. Feels unnecessary. Maybe not tonight. Across the dock, several guests were still recording the moment on their phones. One woman whispered to her friend, "This story's incredible." Another nodded. And it all started with someone mocking him. Vivienne heard that. Her shoulders stiffened again. "People are exaggerating the situation," she insisted. "A single fire incident and suddenly we're rewriting history." But the security officer shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, this isn't exaggeration." He gestured toward Ronan. His name still used in rescue training manuals. The crowd reacted instantly. "Seriously? You're kidding." Luis laughed again. "I told you," the officer nodded. "Case studies. Storm extractions, fuel fire containment." He pointed toward the yacht behind them. Even what he just did tonight, Vivienne's expression tightened further. Her attempt to dismiss the moment was unraveling in front of her. Alara noticed something else, though. The guests weren't just listening. They were starting to admire him openly now. A few donors approached Ronan with genuine curiosity. "How long were you in Rescue Command?" one asked. "Almost 15 years, he replied. "And you just walked away from that?" Ronan glanced briefly at Lena. "Sometimes life asks you to change direction." The girl smiled. "I'm glad you did." Vivienne finally stepped forward again, clearly determined to regain control. "Well," she announced loudly, since everyone seems fascinated by this unexpected guest, she gestured toward the restaurant. "Perhaps we should continue the evening properly." Her smile returned, carefully practiced. Inside, a few guests began moving back toward the doors, but not before several of them shook Ronan's hand first. "Thank you for what you did tonight, both tonight and before. People like you don't get enough credit." He nodded politely each time, clearly uncomfortable with praise. Alara watched the interactions quietly. "You see what's happening?" she said softly. He sighed. "Yeah." They're realizing the truth. Ronan glanced back toward Vivienne briefly. That was inevitable once Lena spoke. Inside the restaurant, the charity dinner was slowly resuming. Glasses clinked again. Music restarted. But the atmosphere had changed. Guests were whispering as they returned to their seats. The story of the dock mechanic was already spreading table to table. Vivienne stood near the entrance, greeting people again, but the confident rhythm of earlier had disappeared. Several donors were clearly more interested in Ronan than the evening program. One man even said quietly, "Honestly, he should be the guest speaker." Another agreed. That would make more sense. Vivienne pretended not to hear. But Alara saw the tension in her posture. The entire narrative of the evening had shifted. And she knew it. Ronan brushed his hands together, wiping away faint traces of soot from the extinguisher foam. "Well," he said quietly, "back to work." Alara raised an eyebrow. "You still planning to act like this was a normal night?" "That's what it was supposed to be," she chuckled. Too late for that, he nodded toward the restaurant doors. "You heading back inside?" "Probably." "Why?" She smiled slightly. "Because the person who mocked you is about to spend the rest of the evening pretending none of this happened." Ronan glanced toward the bright dining room windows. Vivienne was already standing near the podium where the charity presentation would begin. Guests were taking their seats. The story was far from over. Alara folded her arms and looked at him. "You know something interesting about public humiliation?" "What's that?" "The truth usually waits for the right audience." Inside the restaurant, Vivienne tapped the microphone to begin her speech. Outside on the dock, the man she mocked walked quietly toward the doors, and the entire room was about to realize they had invited the wrong person to speak. The microphone crackled softly as Vivienne Halbrook tapped it once, then again. "Ladies and gentlemen, She began smoothly, standing at the front of the restaurant where the marina windows framed the dark water outside. "Thank you for your patience during the brief disturbance." A few guests shifted in their seats. Others glanced toward the doors, because the disturbance wasn't what people were whispering about anymore. They were whispering about the mechanic. Vivienne continued anyway. "As I was saying earlier tonight, maritime safety is something our foundation takes very seriously." The restaurant doors opened quietly behind the crowd. Ronan stepped inside first. He moved the same way he had all evening, calm, unhurried, almost invisible. But the moment he entered the room, the whispers grew louder. Several people turned in their chairs. One donor nudged another. "That's him." The mechanic who had stopped the fire. The commander who had led rescues. The man who had been mocked in front of everyone earlier. Elara followed him in, wiping her hands on a towel she'd picked up from the service counter. Neither of them tried to draw attention. But attention followed them anyway. Vivienne noticed immediately. Her smile faltered for half a second before she forced it back. "As I was saying," she continued, "our charity focuses on prevention, awareness, and leadership in coastal safety." Louise slipped inside behind them with two other dock workers, leaning casually against the back wall. "Leadership," he muttered quietly. The security officer beside him chuckled under his breath. Several guests had turned their chairs now. Instead of watching the podium, they were watching Ronan. Vivienne's voice sharpened slightly. "Tonight we're proud to support initiatives that recognize individuals who dedicate their lives to protecting others." Elara raised an eyebrow. The irony hung thick in the air. Ronan stood near the side wall, arms loosely folded. He wasn't trying to disrupt anything. But his presence alone was changing the room. A man near the front finally raised his hand. Vivienne blinked. "Yes?" The donor cleared his throat. "Before the speech continues, I think many of us would like to acknowledge the person who actually demonstrated maritime safety tonight." Murmurs of agreement spread instantly. Vivienne's smile froze. "I'm sure our staff handled the situation professionally." The donor shook his head. "No," he said simply. Then he turned toward Ronan. That man did. Every head in the restaurant followed his gaze. Ronan sighed quietly. Elara leaned toward him. "Told you," she whispered. Vivienne tightened her grip on the microphone. "That's very generous," she said stiffly. "But this evening is about the foundation." Another voice spoke up from the back. "Actually," Louise called out casually, "it's also about telling the truth." More whispers. More shifting chairs. The security officer stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am, Commander Vale prevented a dock-wide fuel explosion tonight." Vivienne's composure cracked again. "We've already discussed that situation." "But not properly," the officer replied. He looked around the room. Most of the guests here didn't see what happened outside. Phones lifted. Several people began recording. Vivienne's irritation flared. "This is highly inappropriate." The donor who had spoken earlier stood up. "I disagree." He turned toward the room. "Many of us donated tonight because we believe in recognizing real leadership." He gestured toward Ronan. "And it appears we've been standing next to it all evening." Applause started slowly. Just 2 or 3 people clapping. Then 5. Then 10. Within seconds, nearly half the room was applauding. Vivienne lowered the microphone slightly, stunned. The applause wasn't loud or theatrical. It was something else. Respect. The kind that couldn't be bought with charity dinners or polished speeches. Ronan lifted one hand gently. "That's not necessary," he said. But the applause continued. Elara smiled faintly. Luis crossed his arms proudly. Even some of the restaurant staff had joined in. Vivienne's eyes flashed with frustration. "This is ridiculous," she snapped once the clapping faded. "Is it?" The donor replied calmly. She pointed toward Ronan. "He's a mechanic." Ronan tilted his head slightly. "Tonight I was," the donor smiled, and before that, the room leaned forward collectively. Ronan hesitated, then shrugged. "Rescue command," a few guests nodded knowingly. But the donor pressed further. "How many lives did you save?" The mechanic frowned slightly. "I never counted." Louise spoke from the back. "News reports said over 60, the room went completely silent." Vivienne blinked. 60? The security officer nodded. At least, phones rose higher. Guests whispered again. And suddenly the elegant charity dinner had turned into something else entirely. A room full of wealthy donors staring at the quiet man they had watched being mocked earlier that night. Vivienne gripped the microphone tighter. "This isn't a rescue seminar," she said sharply. But Lena's voice suddenly crossed the room from the front table. "Yes, it is." Everyone turned. The little girl stood beside her chair, looking directly at the podium. "Because the man you laughed at," she pointed toward Ronan, "is the reason I'm alive." The words echoed through the restaurant like a bell that couldn't be unheard. For a moment, the entire room stopped breathing. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Chairs creaked as people slowly turned toward the little girl standing beside the table. Lena Halbrook didn't look nervous. She looked certain. Vivienne stared at her daughter in disbelief. "Lena," she said sharply, "sit down." But the girl didn't move. Her finger was still pointed toward Ronan. "He saved me," she repeated. The silence deepened. Alara watched the faces around the room carefully. Earlier they had been amused, then curious. Now something else had taken over. Understanding, the donor who had spoken earlier looked at Lena gently. "What happened?" he asked. Vivienne snapped, "This is not the time." But Lena kept talking. "Our sailboat flipped in a storm," she said. Several guests leaned closer. The waves were really big. Dad was yelling, Mom was crying, and the water was so loud I couldn't hear anything. Ronan lowered his eyes slightly. The memory was clearly uncomfortable. But Lena continued. Then the helicopter came. A murmur passed through the room. "I fell into the ocean," she said softly. Vivienne looked shaken now. "That was years ago," she said quietly. "Yes," Lena replied. Then she pointed again. "And he jumped in after me." The restaurant grew so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning could be heard. Alara felt the weight of the moment settle over the crowd. Every person in the room now understood what Lena was saying. The donor whispered. He pulled her from the water. The security officer nodded slowly. That mission made the news. Luis folded his arms proudly near the back wall. Vivienne looked at Ronan with a completely different expression now. Confusion, shock, and something else she clearly didn't like feeling, embarrassment. "You never told me this," she said quietly. Lena frowned. "You never asked." A few guests exchanged glances. Ronan shifted slightly. "That rescue involved dozens of people," he said calmly. "It wasn't just me." But Lena shook her head. "You were the one who jumped." Vivienne's voice faltered. "Why would you risk your life like that?" The mechanic looked genuinely surprised by the question. That's what rescue commanders do. The simplicity of the answer hit the room harder than any dramatic speech. The donor who had started the applause slowly stood up again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. Everyone turned toward him. "I think we've misunderstood the real purpose of tonight." Vivienne stiffened. "This dinner supports maritime safety initiatives." Yes, the donor agreed. And yet, the person who actually represents that mission, he gestured toward Ronan, was mocked at the door. A few guests lowered their eyes. Others looked openly uncomfortable. The donor continued calmly. While the man who has saved over 60 lives was treated like he didn't belong, Luis let out a quiet laugh. Sounds about right. Vivienne looked around the room, realizing every person present had witnessed the same moment. The humiliation, the mockery, the mistake. Her voice came out strained. I didn't know who he was. Ronan shrugged lightly. That wasn't the problem, she blinked. Then what was? Alara answered before he could. You didn't think he mattered. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. No one argued. Because everyone in the room remembered exactly what Vivienne had said earlier. Dock mechanic, orphan girl, people who didn't belong near real status. Vivienne's face flushed. That's not what I meant. Alara raised an eyebrow. It's exactly what you meant. The tension stretched across the restaurant. Even the staff had stopped moving. The donor stepped forward again. Miss Halbrook, he said calmly. Yes? Tonight's event was meant to honor people who protect lives on the water. She nodded stiffly. That's correct. The donor looked around the room, then back at her. Well, he gestured toward Ronan. You already have one standing right here. Applause started again. This time louder. Not hesitant. Not awkward. A full room of people clapping for the quiet mechanic who had never asked for recognition. Ronan rubbed the back of his neck. You really don't have to do that. But the applause continued. Vivienne stood frozen at the podium. The entire narrative of the evening had completely slipped from her hands. Her charity speech no longer mattered. Her event no longer mattered. Only the truth did. And the truth was standing near the back wall in work boots and a worn jacket. The same man she had mocked in front of everyone. The applause slowly faded. The donor smiled at Ronan. Commander Vale, he said warmly. Ronan sighed. Ronan is fine, the donor nodded. Ronan, he paused. Would you like to say a few words about maritime safety? The room leaned forward again. Ronan looked around the restaurant, at the dock workers, at the staff, at the guests who had witnessed everything. Then his eyes briefly met Vivienne's, and for a moment she looked like she finally understood exactly what had happened. Not just the rescue, not just the humiliation, but the truth behind it. The mechanic she mocked had been the most honorable person in the room all along. The restaurant remained silent as the donor's invitation hung in the air. Would you like to say a few words about maritime safety? Every pair of eyes turned toward Ronan. For a second he looked like a man considering escape. Then he sighed quietly and stepped forward. Alara watched him walk through the rows of tables. The same people who had laughed earlier were now leaning aside respectfully to let him pass. Work boots against polished restaurant flooring. Grease-stained jacket among tailored suits. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Yet somehow, the room now felt like it belonged to him more than anyone else. Vivienne slowly stepped away from the podium. Not because she wanted to. Because she didn't have a choice. Ronan reached the microphone and looked down at it for a moment. Then he looked up at the room. I'm not much for speeches, he said calmly. A few people chuckled softly. But since tonight's about maritime safety, I guess I can say one thing. He rested one hand on the podium. The ocean doesn't care who you are. The room fell completely quiet again. Doesn't care about money, titles, or fancy boats. Several donors shifted in their seats. When storms hit, he continued, everyone's the same out there. He paused briefly. Cold, scared, and hoping someone shows up to help. The simplicity of the words carried more weight than the elegant speeches planned earlier. Alara noticed how the room leaned toward him, listening, really listening. Ronan continued. The people who keep others safe on the water aren't always the ones giving speeches. He nodded toward the restaurant windows. Most of them are outside. Dock workers, mechanics, rescue crews. People who rarely received applause. Louise grinned from the back of the room. Damn right. Ronan smiled faintly. And sometimes, he added, they look like ordinary workers. A few guests nodded slowly. Because the uniform eventually comes off, he said. But the responsibility doesn't. The words settled deeply into the room. Vivienne stood off to the side of the podium now, her earlier confidence completely gone. The speech she had prepared suddenly felt very small. Ronan glanced briefly toward Lena. The girl was smiling proudly at her table. Most rescues, he said gently, don't make headlines. He shrugged slightly. They just happen. The donor who had spoken earlier raised his glass slightly. Well said, several others followed. But Ronan stepped away from the microphone before the moment could grow any larger. I think the charity speech should continue, he said politely. The donor shook his head with a grin. I think we've already heard the best one. Soft laughter filled the room. Even the restaurant staff seemed relieved. But Ronan had already begun walking back toward the side wall. Back to the quiet place he had started the evening. Alara met him halfway. You just gave the speech of the night, she said. He shrugged. Wasn't trying to. That's why it worked. Across the room, conversations began spreading again. But they sounded very different now. One donor whispered, "That man's the real hero here." Another nodded. "And we almost threw him out," Louise chuckled loudly near the back. Almost. Vivienne stood motionless beside the podium. Finally, she stepped down. Slowly. Carefully. She walked toward Ronan. The crowd noticed immediately. The room grew quiet again. When she reached him, her voice was far quieter than it had been earlier that evening. "Mr. Vale," he looked at her calmly. "Ronan is fine," Vivienne nodded stiffly. "Ronan." For a moment, she struggled to find the words. Then she took a breath. "I owe you an apology." Several guests leaned forward slightly. Ronan said nothing. She continued. "What I said earlier was disrespectful." Her voice sounded tight, as if speaking the words required real effort. "I judged you based on appearances." She glanced briefly at Alara. "And I judged her as well." The orphan girl crossed her arms but didn't interrupt. Vivienne looked back at Ronan. "I was wrong." The admission hung in the air. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't graceful, but it was honest. Ronan studied her for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Thank you." The response surprised her. "That's it?" she asked quietly. "What else would there be?" Vivienne hesitated. "I expected anger." He shook his head. "Doesn't solve much." The simplicity of the answer disarmed her. Behind them, the guests began clapping again. Not loudly this time, just a quiet acknowledgement of the moment. Respect had settled over the room like calm water after a storm. And for the first time all night, Vivienne Halbrook looked like someone who had finally learned something she couldn't buy. The quiet applause faded slowly, leaving behind a different kind of atmosphere in the restaurant. The earlier tension had dissolved, replaced with something calmer, something honest. Ronan stood near the side of the room again, exactly where he had been when the evening started. The difference now was that no one overlooked him. People nodded respectfully when they passed. Several guests even stopped to shake his hand. Luz leaned against the wall with a proud grin. "You realize that speech just embarrassed half the donors in here, right?" Ronan sighed lightly. "That wasn't the goal." Louise chuckled. Still happened, across the room, Lena slipped away from her table and ran over again. "Commander." He smiled faintly. "You know you don't have to call me that anymore, but I like it." She hugged him around the waist. "Thank you again." Ronan crouched slightly so they were eye level. "You already thanked me years ago, I know," she said, "but Mom hadn't yet." Behind them, Vivienne stood quietly near the podium. She wasn't speaking, she wasn't directing the event. For the first time that evening, she was simply watching the dock workers laughing near the door, watching the restaurant staff move around the tables, watching the quiet mechanic who had completely changed the direction of her carefully planned night. Ilara noticed her standing there. She walked over slowly. Vivienne looked at her, clearly unsure what to say. "You handled that moment well," Vivienne said after a pause. The orphan girl raised an eyebrow. "You mean the part where your daughter reminded you who saved her life?" Vivienne winced slightly. "Yes, that part." Ilara folded her arms. "You mocked people who were just doing their jobs, I know, and you thought money made someone important." Vivienne looked down at the polished floor. "I know that too." Ilara studied her for a moment. Then she nodded toward the dock outside. "The people out there don't get applause very often." Vivienne followed her gaze toward the marina. The quiet water reflected the restaurant lights like scattered stars. "I suppose they should," she admitted. Nearby, one of the donors approached Ronan again. "If you ever decide to return to public service," the man said, "there are plenty of organizations that would be honored to have someone with your experience." Ronan smiled politely. "I appreciate that, but I already have a job." He gestured toward the marina docks. "Keeping boats safe. Helping when something goes wrong." The donor nodded with new understanding. "Seems like the right place for you," Louise called from across the room. "Hey, Commander. Sorry, Ronan. Someone's asking about fuel line repairs outside." Ronan chuckled softly. "Duty calls." He glanced at Ilara. "You coming?" She grinned. Of course. They started toward the door together. Several guests moved aside respectfully as they passed, work boots again against polished flooring. But this time, no one laughed. Just before he stepped outside, Ronan paused. He turned back briefly toward the restaurant. Vivienne was still standing near the podium. Their eyes met across the room. She nodded once, not like a wealthy host acknowledging staff, like one person acknowledging another. Ronan nodded back. Then he pushed open the marina doors. Cool night air rushed inside again. Outside, the docks stretched quietly into the darkness. Work still needed to be done. Ropes checked, engines inspected, small problems fixed before they became disasters. The kind of work most people never noticed. Ilara stepped beside him. "You know what's funny?" she said. "What?" "You spent the whole night trying to stay invisible. And?" She smiled. "Turns out people finally saw you anyway." Ronan glanced out over the calm water. Maybe that's not the worst thing. Behind them, the restaurant buzzed quietly with conversation. Not about wealth, not about investments, but about dignity, about humility, about the mechanic who turned out to be the most honorable person in the room. And the lesson everyone had witnessed. Sometimes the people standing quietly in the background are the ones holding the world together. Now tell me your next story title. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. School principal suspended the single dad until the Pentagon called her office. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?